How is everyone doing this evening?
Yeah, good.
All right. Well, welcome to our first program, well, really our second program of our 2024 World War II weekend event. I am Ranger Dan Vermilia at Eisenhower National Historic Site. I'm going to introduce my good friend and guest here in just a moment. But welcome everyone here to this year's World War II weekend event. At 5 o'clock, we started our weekend with a walking tour of Gettysburg National Cemetery, talking about World War II casualties buried there. So this is our second program of the event. We're very glad to have everyone with us. We're going to have special programming at Eisenhower National Historic Site the next 2 days, talking about the events of 80 years ago as we commemorate 1944. And this year's event is themed not just around the year, but around the phrase, the Great Crusade, a phrase used by Gettysburg's very own Dwight David Eisenhower 80 years ago as the Allied Expeditionary Force prepared to invade Europe on D-Day. We have lots of great programming, lots of wonderful things going on. Pick up one of these event guides. We have plenty of them here. They're in the main lobby. We also have wonderful exhibits in the main lobby from the Museum of the United States Navy, Museum of the United States Marine Corps. There's also an exhibit in the group lobby featuring some of the items and artifacts from the collection of Eisenhower National Historic Site related to the year 1944. So we're approaching this year in many different ways. This year was more than just one day of June 6th. It was an effort taking place with the United States and our allies across the globe 80 years ago fighting against fascism and tyranny. And our event at Eisenhower typically does focus on the European theater, as one might expect. But this year we thought for our Friday evening program, we wanted to talk a little bit about the Pacific Theater of Operations. And that leads us to our guest for this evening. Henry, thank you for joining us.
I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
So our guest tonight, Henry, is the son of famed World War II Marine Eugene Sledge. I want to ask just folks, how many folks here are familiar with this book here? Excellent. How many folks here have seen the HBO miniseries The Pacific? Excellent. We have a lot to talk about. Well, Henry here, our guest, grew up witnessing his father's memoir with the old breed taking form and coming to life. Through many conversations with his dad about his experiences across the islands of the Pacific, he formed a deep passion for all aspects and history of the Second World War. He has worked as a consultant for Valor Studios and has articles published in Valor and Naval History magazine. His most recent article was the cover story for the autumn 2022 issue of World War II magazine. He has co-hosted World War II podcasts, appeared as a guest on numerous other podcasts and documentaries, spoke at the We Have Ways History Festival in England, the International World War II Conference in New Orleans. He holds a BA from Auburn University, over 20 years of experience in the heavy equipment industry, and he's currently working on a book involving his late father's unpublished writings, which we'll be talking about quite a bit this evening. So I'd like all of us to give a nice warm Gettysburg welcome to Henry. Yeah,
I got a lot to live up to. I got to get busy.
So I think, our program tonight, going to talk a lot about your dad, but one other question I want to ask, one more hand raising. I think it'll be the last hand raising question. How many folks here had a family member who served in the Second World War? So this is a uniting experience for us in many ways today. I think it's something that so many people have a connection with because of those family bonds. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation here tonight about your dad. So to start, can you tell us a little bit about your dad's memoir, With the Old Breed, and what has your relationship with this book been like throughout your life?
The best way I can answer that is to say that, and I've said it many times, With the Old Breed is part of my DNA. I grew up watching my father write that book. The things that are in those pages, the things that were portrayed in the Pacific, I heard from him.
Yeah.
And not in this didactic way of, sit down and let me tell you something. It was because I had this inherent interest in the subject. Growing up back in the 70s, my brother and I watched the television shows of the day like Rat Patrol, Combat, Hogan's Heroes. The movies of the day, like Kelly's Heroes, Patton, The Longest Day, A Bridge Too Far. I grew up watching those movies, and I just had this incredible interest, and a lot of it was just really tactile and detail-oriented. I mean, not so much in a philosophical way as a younger kid, but just the packs and the equipment, the weapons, the tanks, the airplanes. I just had a love for these things from a very early age. And so I don't think there was ever a time when there was not this level of awareness for me personally that my father had been a U.S. Marine and that he had fought in the Pacific and that he had been in the 1st Marine Division.
Yeah.
I mean, those facts are coded into my childhood.
Well, and I think we'll talk more about the miniseries later on in our conversation here, but since you mentioned growing up watching World War II movies, I mean, what is it like to see your father's story end up being portrayed in something that's not a movie per se, but a miniseries seen by millions of people? Like I said earlier, you can only use the word surreal so many times, but that has to be a surreal experience.
Tom Hanks asked me at the premiere, well, what is this like for you? And I started to say, well, I'll tell you what, Tom, I'll let you know when I'm done watching it. But what I actually said to him was, it was electrifying. Because I had seen Saving Private Ryan. I had seen Band of Brothers. I knew every line in both of those films. And so for my father's book to be picked up by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg to be used as source material for the Pacific, I mean, it was literally a dream come true.
Yeah. Well, and so I think we'll talk more about, the Pacific as we go on.
Sure.
But I also want to talk a lot tonight about your recent work editing and publishing some of your father's unpublished writings. When we first spoke about a year ago, you shared with me that With the Old Breed was a small portion of what your dad actually wrote for his memoir, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, and what you've done is taken those unpublished portions and put them into context, added your own thoughts to them, and that's coming out next June, tentatively, right?
That's what my editor tells me.
Yeah. So
I hear some knowing laughs, and there's some authors. My buddy John McManus is sitting right over there, so
yeah.
I'm sure there are going to be many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, but
Yeah.
we hope June of 2025.
Well, I think what I want to talk about tonight with your dad and his experience, not just from your memories of him, but your work going through and looking at your dad's unpublished writings and some of the things that you've gleaned from that. You used a woodworker analogy when we were talking. Can you maybe share that with everybody?
My mother told me, she said, Henry, you need to try to get your hands. This was fall of 2021. She and I were having a conversation about some of the podcasts that I had been on, some of the interviews I had done as I reconnected with this World War II history and became active in the World War II community. And she said, you need to get your hands on the the unedited unpublished, or the unedited original manuscript. She said, there's a lot of material in there that I think you could do something with. Long story short, I got my hands on that through the help of the archivist at Auburn University. And I started going through it, and I use the woodworker analogy because there is a lot of material. It took me several months of going through it with a highlighter in one hand and with the Old Breed in the other. And I wore out like 5 highlighters, highlighting everything that didn't get published. Not all of that was something I wanted to use. But some of it is anecdotally, like intrinsically anecdotal things that happen that are really, I hope people will find compelling or really interesting, that give greater context and richness to the whole Eugene Sledge story. But the woodworker analogy comes in when, like, there may have been one sentence omitted from what he wrote. And, a woodworker who is really good at that can go into his shop and a piece of wood lying on the floor that's seemingly just this inert scrap that's going to go in the garbage can, he can take that. And if he uses his imagination, he can create something beautiful out of it.
Yeah.
There were little conversations. I just dropped my mic here. There we go. There were lines that got edited out that I thought, it's a shame they edited that out because that's really powerful. I can think of one right now, but it's on Okinawa, and I know that's toward the end, so I may not want to bring that out.
We'll circle back around to that. Yeah, I know the one you're thinking about. Well, let's start, through our conversation about your dad. things from the unpublished book, your memories of him that you can share with us. Let's start. I'm going to put a couple pictures of your dad up on screen in his dress blues, and then him on his cot in Okinawa, the two pictures we had talked about. In thinking about your dad and his story, when we spoke a couple weeks ago about our program here, one of the things that really stood out for me about our conversation is when we talked about his enlistment. These memoirs and these accounts of World War II, I think it's revealing and fascinating how everybody speaks about how they became involved in this conflict that took over the world. Tell us a little bit about your dad's background and why it's so interesting and why he was so revered maybe by his comrades that he chose the path that he did.
Well, to say that anything reverential, I think, came after the fact, after the war was over and passed into the annals of history. But my father came from a fairly well-to-do background. My grandfather was a doctor. His father, and his father had been physicians. My grandfather was a man of some influence politically, and as a very prominent physician in Mobile, Alabama, as was depicted in the HBO miniseries. And my father's older brother, my Uncle Edward, had been to the Citadel, was a graduate of the Citadel, and was the 741st Tank Battalion, and ended up winning 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Silver Star fighting across Europe. But before all that happened, my father, coming from the family that he did, could have chosen an easier path. My grandfather could have pulled some strings, gotten him a job at Brookley Field, which was an airfield, an Air Corps airfield in Mobile. He could have done his duty, but stayed out of the line of fire had he chosen.
Yeah.
But that was not the way that he wanted to go. He knew the Marines were the best. He thought they were a sharp outfit. Those are the exact words he used. He said, I thought the Marines were a sharp outfit, and I wanted to be a Marine. And my grandfather and my uncle implored him not to enlist. They said, at least go through officer's training. Be an officer. Life will be better for you as an officer.
Yeah.
And my uncle started the war as a lieutenant, finished as a major. And my father did start out at Georgia Tech in an officer's training program. I think it was a V-12 program. And then several months into this, and he wrote about this one with the Old Breed, but I have a little additional context in my manuscript. He and half the class, the 180-man detachment, were afraid that the war would run its course before they had a chance to get involved in it, and so they purposely flunked themselves out.
Yeah.
And as he said, God, if I'd only known.
Yeah. Well, and he put himself, like you said, he didn't have to be in this position enduring some of these things on the front lines that he did. Along these lines, the unit that he joined, K35, King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Right. There's another excellent book on this unit by Saul David, Devil Dogs, which you wrote the foreword for.
I did.
And it's an excellent book if you want to look at this company throughout the entire war. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of those relationships that he formed with men in his company, what those meant to him for the remainder of his life?
Well, I have so many memories of, especially when he started working with the Old Breed. My father really did not like to talk on the phone. But as he began working with the Old Breed and researching that and reconnecting with some of his veteran friends, of course, there were innumerable phone calls. And for a guy who did not like to talk on the phone, he spent hours. I would hear him, we'd be at supper, we'd be at dinner, we'd be having supper, the phone would ring, and I would answer, my brother would answer, Dad, it's for you. And he'd be like, God damn, because he just didn't want to be bothered.
Yeah.
He'd get on the phone and it was, hey, snafu, and it would be snafu, or it would be Bill Layden, or it would be Stumpy Stanley, stalwarts of K35. And I would hear him just guffawing and laughing for long hours into the night with his K Company buddies. But to speak of one, Bill Layden, and Bill Layden is portrayed so well in the Pacific. And he's shown briefly in an interview before one of the episodes. But Bill was from New York, was a wonderful guy. I loved Bill. Bill adored my father. And Bill was a rifleman. My father was a 60 millimeter mortarman. But to just touch briefly on the depth of that relationship, The day my dad died, Bill was the first guy I called. And he was just, oh, Henry, I adored your father. I loved your father. Your father made me famous. And that was before the Pacific came out.
Yeah.
But I loved Bill. I mean, he was a wonderful guy.
Yeah.
Stumpy Stanley he was on the phone with Stumpy. He was the executive officer of K Company. He became the CO after Captain Haldane had been killed on Hill 140 at Peleliu. And Stumpy fought through most of Okinawa. He was taken out with malaria, I think, pretty close to the end. But Thomas Stanley was his name, Lieutenant Thomas Stanley. But he and Stumpy talked hours and hours and hours. I remember I was out in the driveway shooting basketball one day as I was probably a teenager, and my parents had gone out of town. They might have actually gone out of town to a Marine reunion, First Division reunion, and the phone rang. I ran inside to answer it, and I actually put this, not to give away the store, I'll put this in my manuscript, but I answer it and I hear this gravelly voice, Sledgehammer there. And I said, no, sir, he and my mother have gone out of town. And he said, tell him Stumpy called. And I knew who Stumpy was.
Yeah.
And I have a better context of that he was the executive officer and then the CO of K-35 now as I began to study the history in later years, but I knew that he was a friend of my father's, and I said, yes, sir, I will. And I told that story on a podcast, and on that podcast was Freddie Joe Farnsworth, who portrayed him in the Pacific. And it's a very quick appearance that Freddie Joe has. You don't really know that he's playing Captain Stanley, but he's in the Okinawa episode. But I told that story, and Freddie Joe was on there. He said, Henry, man, you were so lucky to have that from your childhood memories, that you could just pull that up and tell that story.
Yeah. So you have these memories of your dad. You've had opportunities to maybe meet or interact with some of the guys he served with. I want to maybe shift our focus a little bit to the events of 80 years ago. It's September 1944. One of the most brutal battles of the Pacific Theater in World War II is taking place at Peleliu. And this is your dad's first time in combat. I think for our conversation, it's important to have, there's a lot of images we could have gone with. This is one that is striking to me for Peleliu, and we'll get to,
sure.
I think, a quote about it. But in your conversations with him or your work on the manuscript, just to kind of start on this battle, what are some overall impressions or thoughts or memories that you have maybe of things that he shared with you, or something new from the manuscript about this that you uncovered about this brutal fighting 80 years ago?
Well, the essence of it was written in with the old breed, but through conversations, through just growing up, I mean, I can remember going into a surplus store with him and my brother when my brother and I were kids. We were in Mobile visiting my visiting my grandmother, and we went to an Army-Navy store. And this is the early 70s, so there's still World War II equipment in these surplus stores. And he picked something up, oh, I remember we had one like that on Peleliu, and little comments like that he would make. But to speak to Peleliu itself, Peleliu for him represented tragic waste. Because in his mind and in the eyes of every Marine who fought there, the island need not have been hit. And when you look at the larger, in a geostrategic context of it, it could have been bypassed. And ink has been spilled time and time again over that fact. Yeah. And we're here to look at a more microcosmic aspect of this. But how did that play into Sledgehammer? He viewed it as tragic waste. Yeah. And that was not something he could speak about easily. Yeah. Because so many good Marines were killed there.
In his with the old breed, he wrote that it had a weird, the quote is, "The overwhelming grayness of everything in sight caused sky, ridge, rocks, stumps, men, and equipment to blend into a grimy oneness. Weird, jagged contours of Peleliu's ridges and canyons gave the area an unearthly, alien appearance," which is, I think, why I wanted to have this photograph when we're talking about it. Tell us about some of the conditions that your dad was facing there on the island.
Well, the 115-degree ambient temperature. Incredibly high humidity. I think Peleliu was 7 degrees off the equator. So the humidity was incredibly high. The temperature was incredibly high. Shortage of drinking water, as we saw in the Pacific miniseries. And I actually thought more was in with the old breed about the oil drums that they had to scrub out to send in fresh drinking water on D-Day, most of that got edited out. And so I was able to extract a lot of that from the unpublished material and put it into my manuscript. But he talked about going down, you know, a NCO said, hey, I got a working party for you guys. And so they go down where they're steam cleaning the drums, and they're just like, why are we doing this? This is utterly pointless. You know, they didn't know that these drums that had tank fuel and you know, aviation gasoline or whatever were going to be, they were cleaning them out to use for potable drinking water that they might find kind of handy on D-Day at Peleliu. They didn't know that because, of course, they didn't tell them that. But, you know, he talks about how they look out at McKitty Bay, which is surrounding Pavuvu, which is where this was, and the sun is rippling on the water, and it's really a pretty pleasant day, and they're just like, man, let's sit down and smoke a cigarette. We're going to dope off on this working party. And they weren't the only ones. I mean, because, and I do think this was edited out of the original version of With the Old Breed. He talked about how he looked at some of the other drums, at the quality of cleaning that the other guys had done before them, and it looked like it had not been taken seriously. Yeah. So they kind of continued in the same vein. But
yeah, it's 115 degrees. They get water, except it's in an old oil drum. That's hard to fathom that experience. But it's the elements, it's the jagged rocks, and it's also his first time enduring combat.
It is his baptism of fire. Yeah. And I would go even, you know, Peleliu is this confluence of some really unfortunate things. You have the 1st Marine Division commander, Major General William Rupertus, and personally speaking, I think he was probably the least popular, least well thought of Marine Division commanders, okay? I know what my father thought of him. I won't go into that here. It's a little awkward because his granddaughter, Amy Rupertus Peacock, has reached out to me and has gone on and on about what a wonderful book my father wrote. And she's a friend of mine. I mean, she's a lovely lady. She's written a book of her own, memorializing her grandfather's service. We'll just leave that there. But it's a lovely person who's remembering her grandfather, and I respect that. If we are speaking of General Rupertus and what other Marines thought of him, it's inexplicable to me that a Marine Division commander could be so inexplicably optimistic about a battle on the eve of what they were about to face at Peleliu.
Yeah. Well, he described that experience going across the airfield as his most terrifying experience of the war, right?
Yes.
And there's a quote in there about the primordial nature of the combat there on Peleliu and the lasting impact that it had on him.
Well, on Peleliu, there was this topographically complex of caves and ridges. And, you know, I remember my father saying Americans had never seen terrain like this. Yeah. There were ravines, blind canyons, box canyons, 500 caves, all fortified by the Japanese. 10,000 man garrison force of Japanese, highly trained. You know, this had been a part of the Kwantung Army. The Japanese commander was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, who was a tactical genius and was an absolute expert at employing the terrain to his advantage. And there had been this doctrinal shift on the part of the Japanese going into Peleliu, which was we're moving away from banzai charges, needlessly sacrificing our troops, and we want to make the Americans pay for every yard of ground that they gain in blood. And Peleliu was tragically well suited to employ that doctrinal shift. And the Japanese did it to professional perfection.
And I think it's a prelude as well to the later battles and campaigns that the Americans are going to be fighting against. It's this shift towards attrition and grinding and cave warfare.
It absolutely was.
Yeah, that you see time and time again as the war goes on towards its bloody final conclusion. Yeah, it's really, I think, of all the passages in With the Old Breed, some of the things about those initial combat experiences on Peleliu really are quite stunning and visceral.
They are.
Yeah. You know, there's a part in there where your dad talks about frequently praying to get through things or reciting the Lord's Prayer and feeling like God spoke to him on Peleliu. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what helped him get through that? Was it faith? Was it his comrades? Was it his belief in the spirit of the Marine Corps? Maybe all of the above.
I think it was all of the above. I mean, the Marine Corps just has this incredible esprit de corps. The Marines had this incredible love for each other, this devotion for each other, which is common among fighting men. And obviously I'm biased to say this. I think with the Marines, it's just special. I know my father certainly felt it was. They are certainly fiercely proud, deservedly so, of their fighting history. And the 1st Division had this incredible history going back to World War I. But I think, as far as the religious aspect of it, yes, I mean, my father was a man of faith, but religion was a very personal thing to him, and he didn't wear that on his sleeve and really discuss it openly. Yeah. But the part, one of those early nights on Peleliu where he felt like, where he heard this voice, "You will survive the war." Not long before she passed away, my mother and I talked about that. And she said, I think that he felt like God did reach out to him, and it just, that feeling, that knowledge helped get him through such a terrible time in his life.
Yeah. Well, one of the many things about combat memoirs is they can be revealing about different topics, and leadership always tends to be one of these things. That you can learn a lot about leadership through combat memoirs, about people who soldiers revered, Marines maybe didn't revere, and the one leader who really shines through in your dad's writings was his beloved captain, Andrew Haldane.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about ACAC.
You know, I heard my father talk about ACAC, and ACAC was his code name because of Andrew Allison Haldane, A.A. Haldane. And all Marine officers had code names, because you didn't want in the middle of the night, "Hey, Lieutenant," and obviously you earmark your officer to be a target for a sniper. But I heard him talk about ACAC so many times. And Captain Haldane, I think, was probably the finest company commander in the history of the Marine Corps. Again, that is me saying that, not as a former Marine, not even as an official historian, but just one who's met a lot of Marines and certainly grew up hearing my father talk about it. And I think Captain Haldane just was the personification of this quiet competence.
Yeah. And he was always leading from the front, engaged with the men, speaking with them. Killed October 12th, 1944. Today he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. One of the passages your dad wrote about him: "Our company commander represented stability and direction in a world of violence, death, and destruction. Now his life had been snuffed out. We felt forlorn and lost. It was the worst grief I endured during the war. The intervening years have not lessened it." He had this profound impact on him that, like I said, it really shines through in his book. It shines through in the Pacific. Was there anything in his unpublished memoirs that maybe didn't make the final cut about Haldane that you found interesting?
I don't know that there was anything unpublished, but I can tell you this. I mean, the essence of what I do when I do these types of things, when I have these conversations and engage with people who are interested in Eugene Sledge, the essence of it is the fact that I had this relationship with him and I could talk to him and ask him questions. Part of that was knowing when not to ask questions. There was one thing I never asked him, and that was, "Tell me about that day on Hill 140. What was that like when Johnny Marmette came down and you guys are gearing up to go back up into the ridges after you had that Jeep ride?" Which that was unpublished, that I was able to write about more. But when Johnny Marmette comes down and he's telling you guys, ACAC's bought it, Skipper's bought it, how did that make you feel? That is a question I never asked him, and I knew better than to ask him that question, because that would not have been a pleasant conversation.
Yeah. Well, let's, in 1999, you had the chance to go to this island.
I did.
Tell us about that experience.
Being able to, I went with a tour group. Going to Peleliu was just the fulfillment of a dream for me, because I remember being 16 years old, not long after With the Old Breed came out, and I'd had conversations with my father. I had read the typewritten pages as my mother was typing them, as my dad's writing With the Old Breed. And then when the book came out, kind of required family reading, I sat down and read the published copy.
Yeah. Got to read Dad's book.
Got to read Dad's book. And so I already had this obvious level of comfort with the knowledge of Peleliu, this personal relationship with it. And I remember being 16 years old, not long after the book came out, saying to my mother, "Someday I want to go to Peleliu." because I could just imagine, and I began to read about it, you know, in the years, in my adult years, and I knew that it was a sparsely populated, very small island on the, you know, the fringes of the Pacific, not inhabited by many people, not really used for anything, out of the main shipping lanes, and the detritus of war was everywhere. You know, knocked out tanks and amphibious tractors and the remains of aircraft. The thought of seeing this in its native environment just really was incredibly fascinating to me. And so to be able to go on the 55th anniversary, it was just an unbelievable experience. And I can keep talking, but I don't want to get ahead of your questions. I mean,
you mentioned before we started our program tonight about wanting to go to the airfield in Peleliu, this crucial piece of ground that these Marines were fighting and dying over, that your dad had this incredible experience at,
right.
And you had a chance to visit the airfield.
Yeah, well, I mean, so my friend Eric Maylander was our guide on this trip, and he had been like 6 or 7 times. And in my opinion, just a foremost expert. He's actually working on one of the Peleliu maps for my book. I said, Eric, you put me on that airfield right where K Company went across. And he said, okay, I know right where to go. And so we did. And so in 1999, now, interestingly enough, as we talk about the airfield in Peleliu, found out back in June when my buddy John McManus sent me a link to an email article that the Marine Corps has revitalized that airfield and named it Sledge Runway. And the fact that my father's beloved Marine Corps, and I've never been a Marine, but I kind of consider him my beloved Marine Corps too, would remember him in that way is just unbelievable. Yeah. But so now the airfield is in use and it's strategically relevant, and that's a conversation to itself that we don't need to get into now. But in 1999, it's this massive coral strip that the jungle has began to creep back to. And to walk across where K Company went across on D+1, you know, it was a hot, still day. I could hear the jungle birds calling out in the undergrowth. It really was surreal.
Yeah. Well, let's shift a bit from Peleliu. I want to talk a bit more about some of your dad's post-war experience in the Pacific, but we got to at least briefly talk about Okinawa.
Of course.
Your dad served in 2 major battles campaigns. It was Peleliu and then Okinawa in 1945. How did his experience there compare to September 44?
You know, I asked him as a kid, I said, which do you think was worse? And he said, I can't answer that. They were both terrible, yeah. Each in their own way. Peleliu was hot, very little rain, incredibly craggy, rocky terrain. Okinawa, you know, no civilians, no locals. Okinawa was much larger, you know, 60 miles long, yeah. Very close to Japan, very agrarian in many areas, and yet in some areas, the terrain around Kanishi Ridge, just like I mean, he talked about how his knees buckled when they were making a pre-dawn attack up into Kanishi Ridge, and against the flaring light of shell fire being fired onto the ridge, they see this craggy outline, and he writes about it, and I don't know if that got published or if I extracted it from the unpublished work, but he talked about how my knees nearly buckled, became nausea because this reminded me of going up into Bloody Nose Ridge. But on Okinawa, you had this tremendous civilian population, and you had thousands and thousands and thousands of locals who were just so horribly affected, and there was a lot of really poignant material that never got published, and it was beautiful to see, and it really brought out this really incredible facet of my father's character, and that's the kind of man that he was. I mean, he was a Marine through and through, okay? He could rack around and do his job, and he did it many, many times, but he was also a very sentimental individual, a very sensitive guy, which comes through in his writing. And he talks about, and a lot of this didn't get published, he talks about how it broke his heart to see how these local farmers, old men and old women, you know, stooped old figures with little children, how they were affected by, you know, he called it the horrible machinery of World War II, or of war. Yeah.
Well, he's a caring guy. He's deeply impacted by all this. Let's talk a little bit about your dad after the war. He goes on to this career as a biology professor. One of the things I asked you a couple weeks ago, was biology a lifelong interest of his or something that emerged after the war? Tell us a little bit about that.
You know, I think at heart my father Well, I was on my good friend Paul Woodedge, World War II TV, and there's some people in here who've been on that show a few times. Two of them are nodding over there. I love Woody. He's a good buddy of mine. And he said, Henry, and he asked me one of my favorite questions I've ever been asked. He said, how would your father want to be remembered? A Marine, a hero? You tell me, how, an author? And I said, he would want to be remembered as a scientist. Because at heart, that's what he was. He was a scientist. He was a naturalist. And, he had a PhD in biology and biochemistry. And his love of biology, he said, in fact, Ken Burns brought this out in the 2007 production, The War, science was his salvation. As he began to convalesce after World War II and to heal himself emotionally after this incredibly eviscerating experience. But at heart, he was a naturalist. And you see a lot of that with the Old Breed because he's noticing the native bird life, and things like that. And a lot of stuff did not get published with the Old Breed about when they were on Pavuvu. And they're piling into Higgins boats or amphibious tractors to go out among the many islands around the Russell Island complex there, which is 60 miles north of Guadalcanal, where the 1st Marine Division staged, and they were just doing amphibious landing after amphibious landing to hone their skills. And he was noticing the lorikeets and parakeets and the bird life and the local flora and fauna. And he's noticing these things that probably very few young men at that time would have even paid passing attention to.
Yeah. Well, so your dad is, during the war, taking various little notes in his New Testament, uses those to compile his memoir with the Old Breed. And all these years later, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg pick it up, and they make it into a miniseries. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the Pacific? We talked about this a couple weeks ago. You told me you had kind of varying thoughts at various points. Why don't you share that with us?
I love the Pacific.
Okay.
I want everybody in here to watch as many times as they can. When it first came out, I hated it.
Why?
So because I was so close to the story, I was, I'd seen Band of Brothers a million times. I knew every line in it. And here's the thing about me personally, I'm obviously the Pacific Theater is my first love.
Yeah.
Okay. The European theater is close behind it. I have no lack of love and interest in the ETO of World War II. But I was so close to what happened in the Pacific, knowing my father's work. And so I'd watch Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, and I was smitten by the Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg treatment of how they handled World War II. And so, as I've already said, wow, if they would pick up my father's book, it would be a dream come true. Okay, well, they did. They began working on the Pacific, and then when we see it, and I see the little things that got changed, as I watched it the first time, and I had a rough cut that I watched. Just a quick example, if you want me to just jump into this. The scene where they're on Pavuvu, and Sid Phillips is saying, you thank your father for this right here, and 45 will take a Jap's arm off at close range, and he has this 45. And I see that, well, I have my father's 45 that he carried through Okinawa. I have the actual pistol. And so I had sent them pictures of it, and it's one of my prized possessions. And they show him with a model 1917 45 revolver. I hit the roof. I mean, I saw that, and I'm watching this rough cut that nobody else has seen, and I pick up the phone and I call Bruce McKenna, who was one of the executive producers. I'm, what the goddamn hell did you do? I sent you pictures of it. It was a 1911 40 Springfield 45 ACP. I was really upset, but I got over that. Okay. So, long story short, I got over that. And there were other little things that I saw that they changed. That just the first time I saw it, I guess I was just too close to it.
Yeah. Well, you knew it in such an intimate way that few others would not. So I think that's understandable. It's certainly a very unique and rare experience to have your dad's story told in that way. But I think those series like that and pop culture things like that, whether they be movies or miniseries, they do, in large part, spread these stories to large audiences. And I think it helps not just bring awareness, but maybe people who watch that series will pick up the book and learn more about it.
Absolutely.
So I think there's so much merit to them in that sense.
Like I said, I came around to it.
Yeah.
I'm a convert. I love the Pacific. In fact, I'm in the process of rewatching it now for the millionth time. But
Well, no, I think it speaks to one of these ways, again, how we all connect with history. On Sunday, at last day of our event, we're having John Orloff, the writer of Masters of the Air, join us for a conversation about his work in the air war. I think there's so many ways that we connect with these stories. Is there a particular quote maybe from your unpublished, soon-to-be published manuscript, or something that you really think stood out to you, and you think, I can't believe that didn't make its way into the final cut?
Is this where we're circling back?
Circling back.
We're circling back. All right. So we had this conversation. All right. Now the part toward the end of Okinawa, he wrote. It's published with the Old Breed. He wrote about how they had a firing line. Now at this point, I believe this is actually after Kanishi Ridge. The Battle of Okinawa is essentially won. The hard work is essentially won, but of course Marines and soldiers are still dying every day. But there was a certain point where the Marines had lined up along a wall. And it was a pretty well-established tactical position, but my father was in staff, they were in their foxholes. A bunch of the guys had gone down and were on this wall, and it was a firing line. And Japanese stragglers, infiltrators were running openly exposed, and they're squeezing off rounds and picking off the Japanese. And my father participated in that briefly, but went back to his foxhole. And a Marine, one of his buddies, came back up to his foxhole. He said, "Sledgehammer, it's like an old-time shoot. It's like an old-time turkey shoot. It's like Lexington and Concord. Come on down." And my father said, "No thanks, I'm good in my hole. I'm good right here." Well, what got edited out, and I thought this was really powerful, this one little line, and it jumped out at me, because this is literally the last thing. I'm just giving the store away here. Nobody's going to read my book now. This one little line, it's the last thing I quote from him. "Despite how much I hated my enemy, I was disgusted with killing at that point."
Well, I think this story, obviously, there's so much interest in your dad's story from the book and the miniseries. We appreciate you sharing some of these glimpses and memories and remembrances, because so many people have these of our own family members who fought in the war, things that are passed down. And that's why I think this is such a fascinating program that you're sharing with us here. It's such a relatable thing, because so many people do have these memories of maybe asking a grandfather why they fought, or your dad what his experience was, and the fact that these stories are spread so far with the Old Breed in the Pacific. We're gonna give folks a chance. If anybody here has some questions for Henry, we'll pass some microphones around here. We've got one up in the top there. Anybody in our audience have any questions here tonight? Got one right down here.
Yeah, two questions for you. One, can you tell us one of the stories that did not make it into your book, no matter how passive or inane you might think it'd be? And number two, was there anything about your father's World War II experience that bled into his fathering of you, that you realize that he's telling you things or stuff like that the other kids aren't being told to do?
Suure. Well, so, I mean, the aspect of how did my father's service inform his experience as a husband and a father, that suffused everything. As a kid, I would complain about something my mother had cooked, okay? Something no parent ever hears. And, you know, I would be sitting there just going on and on about it, and my father would say, "I'm just happy I have dry socks. You know, why don't you stop complaining?" You know, I remember one morning he made toast for me, and it wasn't toasted exactly the right way. So I started complaining about it, and he said, "Did I ever tell you about," and I actually put this in my manuscript, "did I actually tell you about how on Okinawa we would sit there with our bread and pick weevils, living weevils, out of the bread? Did I ever tell you that?" And I said, "No." And he said, "So stop complaining."
Kind of hard to not eat the toast.
Yeah, you know, but Kevin, your the other question about anything that didn't get published, I really felt like I covered. I mean, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that part, because I don't want to.
So you were saying that there were parts that you found interesting, and so you put in the memoir, implying that there were parts that you didn't think needed to be put in the new one.
Sure. Okay, I'll give you an example of that. So, one thing that he actually wrote a lot about, he noticed how, like, some of his squad mates had various types of accents. The New Englanders or the Texans, there were a lot of Texans in K Company, or other Southerners. And then he had a buddy, and this is just, it was such a cool part, and I was so happy to bring it in. A buddy that he called Red. This guy was a hillbilly. And just, I mean, this kid had not made it past the 5th grade, as it turns out, because his father was a moonshiner. And the kid didn't go to school because his father would be working in the still and make Red sit up there and watch for revenuers or whatever you want to call them. Well, so this kid got very little education, couldn't read or write. Well, my father, you know, Red, they were sitting in their tent, and so Red got a letter from his sister. And he said, "Hey, Sledgehammer, the handwriting's really sloppy. Can you just read this or help me read her handwriting?" And my father was a very sentient, very sensitive kind of guy, as we've already touched on. He sat down by the light of a flambeau in this tent, and he starts reading to Red. Red's just sitting there, just like hanging on every word from his beloved sister. And my father writes that he said, I was paying attention to him, and he said that it was written in this clear, legible, beautiful hand. There was nothing wrong with the handwriting. And he said, I finished reading the letter and started talking to Red, but he started talking to me about his sister, and then he said, Red told me that he never learned to read or write. So from then on, they had this tacit understanding that Red would get a letter, and he would get my dad to read it to him, and then Red would dictate his response. My father would write his letters for him. And I included that because I just think that's beautiful. But what I didn't include was my father writing about the various accents he noticed and how he felt as time went on my father was not a huge fan of television, you know, and he felt like television was homogenizing accents and kind of flattening the curve on various regional accents and this kind of thing. And so he wrote extensively about that, and I didn't include that because I knew I couldn't bring everything in. I mean, I had to go back and cut out a lot of stuff I didn't want to cut out when my agent said, look, we got to get this thing down to 110,000 words. Because good Lord, I can't even remember how long my original manuscript, when I had everything, it was incredibly long. And I had to go back and start honing stuff out. But that would be my example for that, Kevin.
Other questions? Got a couple down here. Here we go. We'll bring in a mic over.
Thank you very much for sharing these memories. It's really neat to hear this. So I'm sure many of us were maybe fans of your father even before this, because he was in a number of documentaries on the History Channel. And I remember him and Sidney
Phillips.
And I remember one time your father, I think he was trying to go to get a job, and there were some issues that he didn't have experience for the job because he'd been obviously serving in World War II. Do you have any thoughts or comments on some of those stories he might have told you?
Yeah, I think that you're referring to when he was registering for classes at Auburn University. And I actually, the way they filmed that scene in the Pacific is really good. I mean, Joe Mazzella did a great job of playing my father, and it's a well-filmed scene, and it hews to the truth. But I remember my father telling me himself, and he said he's standing there in line with all these other young guys, a lot of whom had not served, and of course everybody's wearing civilian clothes, and he steps up to the line in the registrar's office, and the young lady is, did you have any accounting? No, ma'am, I didn't study any accounting. Did you learn did the Marine Corps teach you how to repair things? You know, because she had asked him, were you in the service? He said, yes, ma'am, I was a Marine. And she goes through this list of questions. Did they teach you this? Did they teach you this? Do you have any experience doing this? And he has to say no to everything. And as he's standing there, he's feeling this rush of blood to his face because he can hear people start to snicker behind him because this young lady is getting visibly frustrated. And finally she says, did the Marine Corps teach you anything? And he says, lady, they taught me how to kill Japs. Now, Joe Mazzella does a great job of it in the scene, but the way my father actually said it was that way, very forceful in a voice, and the way he described it, he said, I said it in a voice as loud as thunder. He said the entire room you could have heard a pin drop. And she's just sitting there, open mouth, looking at him. And he said, there was a killing war going on, and I had to do some of the killing. And most of my buddies got killed or wounded and didn't live to come home. And if that doesn't fit into an academic course here at Auburn, then I'm sorry. And she just said, I'm very sorry. And he said, you couldn't understand. It's okay.
We have another question in the front here.
Yes, sir. Maybe to just dovetail with that, my favorite episode, I think, in the Pacific is the last one when your father goes home in Mobile, and maybe the scene that I always go back to is he's experiencing night terrors, and his father, who seems to understand perhaps better than his mother because of his own experience in World War I, just sits outside his room and keeps vigil. And but I'm wondering, do you have a sense of what or who helped your father deal with the trauma he experienced at a time where we didn't have terms like PTSD? How did he deal with that over the years?
100% it goes to what you said, my grandfather. My grandfather, and one of the great regrets of my life is I never knew him. He passed away in 1952, and I was born in 1965. But my father always told me, because I asked him, what was it like when you came home? You know, why did you struggle? Because having survived Peleliu and Okinawa, you had to feel like you could take on anything in life. You know, how could you not feel that way? And he said, well, there was a lot going on in my head, you know, but he credited my grandfather. I think my grandfather was an incredibly perspicacious, intelligent, understanding man who not only was a physician who had dealt with, they called them shell shock victims in World War II, but now we know the term PTSD. And I thought my grandfather was beautifully portrayed in the Pacific, but my father told me, Pop was what he called him. He said, Pop was there for me, and we could talk about it, and he understood. My grandmother, on the other hand, was also very accurately portrayed because my father talked about how she would, in fact, they filmed that scene, you know, Eugene, you need a plan for the future, but you have to do something, Eugene, you know, I mean, I had conversations with the producers about my grandmother doing that. And then my grandfather coming out and say, Mary Frank, leave him alone. You have no idea what men like him have been through. So does that speak to your question?
I think we have time for one more.
I'd like to, I read your father's book when I was a young lieutenant, way back when, and I like to incorporate a lot of that, into, or at least I hope to incorporate that into my career in the Marine Corps. But one of the things that struck me most about the book, and it has struck me about the books that I have categorized as the best memoirs, is the simplicity of the language and just the honesty in the telling of the tale. And so I was wondering is how much, because you've talked about there were things that were edited and removed, which every editor does,
sure.
Every book agent does. But how much of that was, no, we're going to change how you say these things or change how you say this? Or was it, no, we're just going to remove these things but leaving that purity of the language? Because it's a powerful book. Actually, sorry, I had to put it down after Peleliu and take a 2-week break because it just bothered me so much.
Well, first of all, thanks for your service as a Marine and thanks to all U.S. Marines. But to answer your question, I think things were removed that were their own events, okay? And then there was a lot of just sentence structure, changing how things were written. You know, my father, and this actually worked to help me out going through the unpublished material, he really was a very verbose writer, but his editor helped slim that down, you know, but without changing, you know, you don't, and there are people here who've written way more books than I'll ever write, but I think an editor, you make it more packageable and readable and sellable without changing the essence of what is being said. I hope that's a fair way to put that. And In the case of my father's editor, Bob Smith, I think it was Colonel Bob Smith, was who edited With the Old Breed. He had been a Marine era Vietnam era Marine. And my parents felt like he did a wonderful job of editing With the Old Breed. And it's fascinating to see because I've actually got this cardboard box. Andrew, you know the one I'm talking about. This cardboard box where Colonel Smith had taken physical pages of the manuscript and literally cut out little sentences, and literally cutting and pasting the way you do it in 1975 or 77, whenever it was. But I don't think the character or essence of anything that he said was changed, but maybe grammatically it was. That's a good question. I mean, that can get really down in the weeds because I've had to go back through. Again, realizing the verbosity of some of the way my father wrote, and I don't mean that critically at all, but it is a truth. And so when I'm at, however long my manuscript was, when I had to go back and hone it down to 110,000 words, and I still didn't get it, I still got to like 113,000, but it's just like, okay, I've got to simplify this sentence without changing the character of what he said. Does that speak to your question?
That does. Because a good editor helps you tweak the grammar, tweak the structure, but doesn't change the voice of the author.
Right.
So that's good to hear.
Well, Henry, I want to thank you again for joining us. I think, like I said, so many at the start when everybody raised their hands about family connections to the war. It's this experience that still defines the world we live in today. This weekend, World War II weekend, is about honoring those who served 80 years ago. It's also about remembering our ties to them. It's a weekend of commemoration and memory. And I think stories like these, I know just for me personally, they make me think about my own family members who served in the war, and not in these battles or situations necessarily, but they bring back memories for me. So I want to thank you. When we talked a couple weeks ago, it's a sensitive thing to talk about your dad's experiences like this for an audience. So I appreciate that. We appreciate that very much, and appreciate you coming quite a distance to join us with your family for this. I want to present you. We have challenge coins every year for our World War II weekend event. This year's coin has the SHAEF symbol on it for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. So I want to say thank you for joining us. We are going to have a book signing at this point in our evening. A few tables will be set up in the bookstore outside the main theater. We're going to ask folks to wait a couple minutes before rushing there. A couple of our guest speakers are signing books tonight. A couple are signing tomorrow afternoon. Henry is going to be able to sign some copies of his dad's book for us. We also have Dr. John McManus signing copies of some of his books. We have Dr. Jared Frederick over here signing some copies of his. Kevin Hiemel, who's speaking at the site tomorrow, will be signing tomorrow afternoon copies of his books on George Patton. I'm trying to think if we have other folks who are signing tomorrow who are with us here tonight. Yes, Dr. Myers will be signing copies of her book on the Women Air Force Service Pilots tomorrow. So have another book signing tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock here at the Visitor Center. I want to encourage folks, come on out and visit us this weekend, pick up a program guide. We have hundreds of reenactors on site portraying various units from 1944. Kids activities. Kids will be able to earn 5 stars as they go around the camp doing various activities and get their own World War II style dog tag. We also have trading cards that were made featuring stories of fallen World War II soldiers, sailors, airmen buried in the National Cemetery with QR codes and information on the back about their various stories. So lots of great stuff this weekend. Again, give us a couple minutes to get our book signing set up. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you again, Henry.
Thank you.
Folks, if you could remain seated so we could get the authors out, that would be appreciated.